In the previous video, we imported this special training services project with these two special services, and we made sure we can use the dashboard to automatically check progress when implementing the hands-on exercises. Currently, this baseline hands-on exercise should work and show the OK status. In this video, we'll continue with hands-on number 1. As we demonstrated in the previous video, our virtual service currently works fine just for the exact same requests that we imported in the past. And that may be a good thing when you run integration tests, but it's definitely not sophisticated enough to support testing from the point of view of a tester or a developer. As a tester or as a developer, I want the virtual service to return some meaningful responses for any meaningful request, not just for exactly the same values that I imported in the past. As the mitigation, we will make the virtual service more versatile by introducing a more flexible request matching mechanism. Let me explain. Let's take, for example, the request number 3 and use it here as the request. When we press send, we get some meaningful match, and the retrieved assets are some ETFs, some bonds and stocks. So that all depends on what the purpose and the risk level of this investment is. It should definitely not depend on my name. If my name is accidentally Jack, it should probably retrieve the same response. But what I get is the default response instead. And why is that? When we have a look inside our data model, you can see the request matching is very strict. We have is conditions on all the columns. And as I explained in the previous video, you should see these rows as a sort of a if-then clauses. So if all these conditions are met, only then this row is matched, and only then these action functions will get executed, and they will fill in these values to the response. If no row matches, then definitely the default rule will always match and provide some dummy default values. So I don't care what my name is, and that's why I can ignore this column from matching. See? The header of the column got gray. If you have gray color, it means there are at least some gray columns, and a gray column means an ignore column. We use green color to signalize condition functions, and we use violet color to signalize action functions, meaning functions that set values to response. So currently we ignore the name. When I restart simulation, we can test again. So now the name is Jack, I'll press send again, and now I get some meaningful match. I get exactly the same set of assets as previously for John. That's because now the corresponding row matched, since as we only looked into these other columns and use these condition functions to match the corresponding request response row, which means now the request matching is a little bit more flexible. But actually, I don't care what's the surname as well, and citizenship and so on. So that is why I can ignore everything pertaining to the customer. So now all these columns are ignored. Now it will only depend on these 3 condition functions, which of the rows will get selected, if any. I'll restart the simulation, and let's perhaps test for a different surname, like Smith, different citizenship, like Germany. Yeah, it works. I didn't get the default response. This is exactly what's required here in step number 1 of hands-on 1. Additionally, we should also ignore the intended investment value structure. So let's go back to the designer and ignore this. You can modify the functions from here, or sometimes it's more user-friendly to display the row in row detail by right-clicking the row and selecting row detail or Ctrl-D. And now you can ignore these values here as well. This row detail view is helpful, especially when you want to drill down through the data to see every single detail. In the table, the best practice is to have only those columns displayed that have some special business meaning. When you want to inspect the message in higher level of detail, this row detail view is much better. Here you can see all the details about the retrieved assets. But back to the condition functions. As you can see, currently the row matching only depends on these two columns, the purpose and the risk level. Everything else is ignored. And it makes sense because the purpose of the investment is definitely important as well as the risk level. So let's save it and restart simulation. And let's check the next steps required to complete this exercise. Okay, as step number 2, we should make sure that we receive different response for speculation and for hedging. For speculation, the suggested assets are expected to be more risky. So let's test it. Yeah, I think oil is quite a risky asset. But what is important is that for speculation, we have one type of response, and for hedging, we have a different one. In the third step of this hands-on, we'll demonstrate the custom condition functions. Let me show you now how they can help us when implementing our portfolio suggestion service. Currently, we have is conditions on these two columns, on the purpose and on the risk level. Inside our data model, there are 6 sample requests and responses for various representative use cases. 3 of them are for speculative purpose, 3 of them for hedging. Each of these 2 groups have also examples for different risk levels. Now let's test what happens if we specify a slightly different number on input recorded in this table. For example, instead of 80, we could use 81. We obviously get the default response because in our data model we match exactly these values that we previously imported. But from the business point of view, specifying risk level of 81 shouldn't retrieve all too different result than if you specify the risk level of 80. It's just minor difference, so why not reuse the already captured data? The problem is that in this case, this simple is condition will not help us. We'll have to create something a little bit more sophisticated, and this is where custom conditions will help us. To create a custom condition, you expand this drop-down and select New Function. As many things in SV, also this custom condition should have its human-readable name. Let's call it Next Lower Value. And let me explain what I mean. So for the risk level of 81, I would expect this row would be retrieved for speculation and this row would be retrieved for hedging. For the risk level of 55, this row would be retrieved for speculation, this row would be retrieved for hedging. So that's the meaning of next lower value. And how to specify it? So for this purpose, we have these special variables. If I specify a condition like this, that means exactly the same as the is function. What I have here is comparison between what I get in simulation from request and what is here inside one of these cells. This is a Boolean condition that evaluates to true or false, and this is how we would write the is function. But now we need an expression that will evaluate to true if what comes in request during simulation is higher or equal. That will look like this. So this particular condition will evaluate to true if, say, we receive 85 in request. 85 is higher than 80, so this row would match. Also this row would match and this row, but this one is the topmost one, and the higher the row is, the higher priority it has. So this is exactly what we need. This condition will evaluate to true for exactly the next lower value. I press OK, and you can see the new condition function is now selected on this column. You can use the same function also elsewhere. If you want to later edit custom condition functions that you created, you can go to your data model and simply click Edit. So custom condition functions can be shared across your data models. Okay, now our matching is a little bit more flexible. I will restart simulation and go here, and I will try to use the exact same request with the same risk level of 81 now. And now you can see it retrieved a meaningful output for me, which I guess in this case for hedging and risk level of 81 should be this row. We can check it, for example, according to this transaction ID, which ends on 1165. So if I scroll down here, you can see it's 1165. So that's exactly as we expected. So now whatever risk level I use here will retrieve me one of these representative examples, the closest one with respect to the risk level value. So now let me navigate to the dashboard and check the second exercise. As you can see, we received this OK status, so we implemented hands-on 1 correctly. One additional side note: keep in mind these custom conditions are only for matching, they are not for setting values. Custom conditions are something very similar to SQL where clause. In fact, in background, custom conditions are implemented using where clauses on SQL database. So you can also use constructs like substring, various operations with date, and so on. This designer currently uses the embedded Firebird database, and some where clause constructs can be specific for a specific database. So if you use custom conditions, make sure your designers are using the same database type as your servers.